Good morning. We are here for a treat. One of the privileges of the president is to choose who is going to give the two keynote speeches. One of them is the Gerald Marks Lecture. I was telling them that I'm being a little mean because I'm putting them on the spot. I wanted to do something different, and I chose Pat Sylla and John Mellinger because I know they were going to do it. Both of them are people that think out of the box. I had had the privilege of working with them in the exec committee during my presidency year, and now that I'm immediate past president. And I have learned to respect what they do. I have learned to respect their judgment, and I have learned to respect the passion they have for SAGES, as well as the passion for the human being, their colleagues. I have to say the formal introductions, but I'll be brief. Pat Sylla was born in France and was raised in Côte d'Ivoire. Sorry, Pat, you'll correct me with that. She graduated from Weill Cornell Medical College and then did her residency training in Columbia University, completing her colorectal surgery at Mount Sinai Hospital and advanced laparoscopic surgery at Massachusetts General Hospital. John Mellinger is the Roland Falls Endowed Chair of Surgery, Vice Chair of the Department of Surgery, and Professor in the Department of Surgery and Medical Education at Southern Illinois University of Medicine in Springfield. I have a whole paragraph to read, but both of them are so much more than what their CV says. And I'm just going to introduce them and go back and sit in the audience to enjoy this presentation. Thank you very much. Pat and John.
Pat, it's great to be here with you today and with this group of colleagues who we've missed being with for so long. We're here to celebrate something that is special to this organization, and that's the legacy of Gerry Marks. Gerry is now 96 years old. He was one of the founders of SAGES, one of the founders of IFCs, our international society, one of the founding associate editors of our journal. He's an artist, he's a colorectal surgeon par excellence, as you know from what you do. And he's the dad of John Marks, who's one of our dear colleagues here in SAGES. So it's very special to celebrate this and to have this time with you. And for the audience, if you haven't noticed, and thanks to our AV team for this, Gerry's many accomplishments as reflected in his CV are the background to that whole screen. So really special to have this time. Pat, it's good to be with you.
I can't even believe that we're here today after everything we've gone through. And it's such a pleasure and honor to honor Gerald Marks, of course, but also Horacio. So much to say and to thank and be grateful for, and to be with you, to share the stage with you this morning is really surreal. So thank you.
Well, I have nothing to disclose, but I will say that Pat's a highly sought after person by many organizations. So we want to just...
And none of those disclosures are relevant to this talk today, so.
So Pat, you're a well-known leading clinician, cancer surgeon, researcher, educator, and this past year, as we reflect on what we've learned, you were at ground zero in New York City, where some of the harshest aspects of the pandemic and all it brought down on all of us came to bear. Can you begin by sharing with us what that was like and what you learned personally from it?
Mm-hmm. Thanks, John. Well, unfortunately, we're still in the midst of a fourth COVID wave, and that is soaring in many parts of the country, as you know, and many colleagues are still struggling to just deal with the peak in infection rates and hospitalization and death. So I just want to first say that our heart goes out, obviously, to healthcare workers who've lost loved ones during the pandemic, and especially our frontline workers right now who are working so hard. They've sacrificed so much already, and they're still putting their own health at risk to take care of COVID patients. So obviously we are not at a point now where we can truly debrief about what happened and say the crisis is over and celebrate our successes and learn from our mistakes. But I think as we stand here today, we can all agree unanimously that we have learned a tremendous amount from this experience. We've learned a lot about ourselves, about our fears or flaws, but also about our resourcefulness and our resilience, our ability to get together as a community and respond to this crisis. And I think that's really important to be able to reflect and celebrate that. So the New York City experience is in many ways very much symbolic of what's happened with COVID and how it has devastated our communities. It's really hard to believe that just 18 months ago, we were riding the subway completely unaware of the crisis that was about to unfold. I remember even myself, I was coming back from Beijing in late November from a teaching course in China. It was really a wonderful course. But I can tell you we had really no idea. Even by the end of February, when things were starting to look pretty dire in New York City, riding the subway, hardly anyone was wearing a mask. We were really just not paying attention. And then the COVID crisis hit pretty hard. As you know, the city really got totally deflated, and we retreated. We were forced into a New York City pause in March 2020. And it was really unbelievable to see New York City completely beaten down. It was just an absolute ghost town. So in the hospital, we were pretty much forced to stop all elective surgery pretty early on as we were preparing for the surge. We really literally were pleading with the hospital administrators to let us prioritize advanced cancers and immunosuppressed patients. We had to stop hospital transfers pretty abruptly. I was unable over a week to transfer a leak back to my hospital from across town and a couple of perforated diverticulitis cases. So that was really frustrating. And I think this is really hit that we had become the epicenter of the pandemic. And so at that point, fear literally replaced frustration. Our surgical floors were very rapidly converted to COVID wards. I think every hospital in the area went through the exact same protocols. And then our staff and our residents and some of our anesthesia attendings fell ill. So we started to really struggle with manpower, even on our own units. And then, of course, we lost some patients, and that was the hardest, to lose some of our hospital staff. So we were really struggling, and as you know, it was no mystery or surprise in the news. We had a tough confrontation with the nurses. We were struggling for PPE supplies. We were especially struggling with the lack of transparency from our leaders, the lack of guidance, ever-changing protocols on a daily basis, really sketchy information, and of course, we were lacking effective treatments. Our medical colleagues were deployed first, and then it eventually became all hands on deck. So our department got deployed probably last, but essentially at our hospitals, we started to create some teams that consisted of attending surgical residents, but also medical assistants and PAs when we had them. And we're essentially deployed at all our flagships hospitals in the city: Brooklyn, Queens, Midtown, and Upper East. And some of the surgeons refused to be deployed. And some of them were considered to be too high risk to be on the front line. And the rest of us were deployed throughout the city. And it was typically deployment about 4 to 6 weeks, 3 to 4 shifts, 12 hours. I made this decision with my family to separate from my boys for the sake of our safety, and it was a very difficult time to do that. I was deployed first to the step-down unit, Midtown, and then the emergency department in Queens Hospital, Queens was hit particularly hard during the pandemic. We were helping pretty much in the ICU with PD catheters, tracheostomies, central lines. And then the ED, we were pretty much helping with admissions, transporting patients, trying to keep them alive. We were coding patients on the floor in the ED. It was pretty overwhelming. I think the most frustrating part for us was the utter sense of not being able to help and not being able to really do anything and reverse what was happening. And it was especially the dread, especially in the step-down unit, walking into these rooms and looking at the O2 set monitor literally plummet down and seeing the terror in our patients' faces. And that was literally reflecting our knowledge of what was or was not going to happen next. So that was really hard to cope with. I think what really kept us going and stayed motivated were the daily protocols. We're good about rounding and really latching onto the critical care attending. So we're really the only ones with some kind of knowledge about the crisis. And we were really hoping every day for a new cocktail, based on promising results from another part of the world. I literally attached myself to the respiratory therapists. They were literally the lifeline of our teams. and also the critical care attendings, who were really amazing throughout that fight, and latching on to the most zealous ones, the ones who just wouldn't give up no matter what everybody else said. And that was really important for us. In terms of information at the time, the most reliable source of information was those daily briefings from Governor Cuomo at the time. This was really the only time we got a sense of what was happening across the state, the trends, and the statistics, which were really disturbing. 799 is a day that we'll never forget in New York. It's the day that we lost 799 patients in a single 24-hour period. And for those of us who dealt with the 9/11, were there in New York City, this was really reminiscent of that sense of powerlessness as we were waiting for trauma victims that never came in the trauma bay. So that was really traumatic for a lot of us. But we rallied. We knew that the enemy was faceless and there was really no end in sight at the time. But we trusted that the lockdown would help get us through eventually. I want to emphasize, the impact on us as individuals. While I was on the front line, I myself, for sure, a lot of us really struggled with the social isolation, not being with our families. I was very fortunate. I had Dana Sands is one of my good friends and colorectal surgeon in Florida, and Florida was completely blissfully spared from the entire thing at the time. So she was still working, and she happens to also be on the side, besides a colorectal surgeon, she's also a very avid weightlifter. And so she took it upon herself, her and her son were actually doing everyday Zoom-based workout sessions, and I can tell you, she really pulled me through the dark times. So thank you, Dana, for carrying us through this crisis. And we received so much letters of support. I mean, friends from all walks of life, sending letters of support. This is a T-shirt from my friend Sonia Ramamurthy at UCSD and her team. And she actually had a fifth grader in school, and the entire school wrote little essays of letters of support that they sent to our team, and I said, just send it to your team on the front line. I mean, these little small moves, these little things were so important and valuable at a time when you really needed the support. And I'm not mentioning, obviously, the calls from my CJ's family and CJ's friends, who were really incredibly supportive during this time, and that really made a big difference. Especially from our critical friends like Rob Lim and Colin, making sure that I was up to date with my trauma protocol, and it was really, really helpful.
It's incredible to hear that story rehearsed again for us, Pat. Thank you. And as I think of you as a leader of this organization, what have you taken from those experiences that can help inform us as an organization as we continue to navigate what's become a chronic situation rather than just an acute one?
Yeah. Well, I think as surgeons, citizens in general, and leaders of our communities, we really learned that it was all about teamwork. We had to pull together to really get through the crisis. And I have to tell you that I could not be more proud of our surgical residents. I mean, for us, besides the respiratory therapists, I can tell you we couldn't have pulled through without our residents. I was so impressed. I mean, obviously they were more up to date with their trauma protocols, but the resilience that they displayed, how they handled the brunt, the emotional and physical strain of running those teams, they were literally running the teams, was invaluable. So I'm incredibly grateful to them. But again, it reinforces the concept of us getting through this through teams. But as leaders, there were things that we really were in a position to do, such as leveraging our relationships with patients, with donors. A lot of us who had some contacts in the city made some calls. I mean, we were literally on the phone when we were not working, rallying patients. And we were very lucky in New York City. Celebrities spread the word through social media. We were able to get donations of PPEs to the hospital. They contributed funds to help feeding our frontline workers. They were literally, there was practically no stores that were functioning, and to give food, provide food for the frontline learners. And then also transport us, back and forth from home. So that was incredibly helpful, and you realize the power that you have, within a community, mobilizing a community to really pull together. So that was really very impactful. But there's no question, and I want to emphasize today, this is really important to remember, the biggest source of comfort and support that I received during this time came from SAGES. At the time, Rory, who was our president, and the exec took on the challenge, and she was obviously in Long Island and New York, so she was completely in the same situation as we were, so she was fully aware of what was going on. But she took it upon herself to really lead our members during this time of tremendous distress. And that was really important. For example, so Horacio Asburn, who was our next president, leveraged SAGE's really close relationship with other professional organizations, international organizations. With Sally Matthews, they organized the Coronavirus Global Surgical Collaborative. And that was at the very early stage, early March, when the crisis was hitting pretty hard. And so this was a collaboration between SAGES, EAES, AEC, K-Cells, and ELSA. This is to show you the breadth of the relationships that the organization has. And the organization leaders essentially got together and gathered the experience of their members on the front line to generate information about COVID-19 preparedness and response. So from best practices in the use and reuse of PPEs, to the role of MIS during the crisis, the pros and cons of using insufflators and the type of insufflators, infiltration systems in the OR in the face of COVID. All this information, what was happening with plasma donation was essentially used to generate documents that were published very rapidly online for dissemination. And that was really critical to get all these documents out very quickly. SAGES has generated essentially all these, I'm sure you saw those notes from the battlefield and all these other documents, and it's incredible the volume of product that came through. For me, at least, this SAGES initiative became a lifeline, because being on the front line took a different meaning. It was about getting all my friends in New York City to gather our experience collectively and put it together and share how to cope with being on the front line, how to prepare yourself and brace yourself. So this really was incredible, and in turn, what I was really impressed with the fact that the SAGES committee, members rallied very quickly and were able to turn these materials around very fast, vetted it, and published it online. And it was downloaded thousands of times. I mean, I don't have the final number. I don't think Jason has given me the final number. The number of downloads was overwhelming. It's really to show how impactful these documents were. Again, I want to thank the committee members, especially the QoS committee and the acute care committee, who turned also this material over into webinars very quickly that were attended by thousands of people from around the world. So really quite impactful, as well as some publications. So there's been a lot of really incredible collaborative work that emerged from our surgical and medical colleagues during this time. But I want to emphasize that the initiative by SAGES, this initiative was really meaningful, because first and foremost, it was really intended to support and guide our members who were really struggling during deployment. And it was very early on, they were focused on mitigating the impact of the crisis on our wellness. And this is really where it had the most impact for those of us on the front line. So for myself, and for many who struggled, it was really these weekly calls of putting that information together and generating that discussion that really kept me grounded. So I am very grateful for this. As an organization, I think there's no question that our collective experience over the last 18 months has forced us to really reflect on our priorities and our values. As physicians, we've had to prioritize our health, our family, and definitely our wellness. Especially in New York City, we've seen a massive exodus of medical people away from the city, looking for a fresh start. And many of us still struggle with the various phases of grief. So it's been really important to have that support during that time. And I want to emphasize also the work that Horacio started, the RPS, so the reimagining the practice of surgery, which actually started before COVID. And the intent was really to look at ways to develop joy and meaning in our profession. And during the pandemic, there's no question that this took a whole new meaning and gained a lot more urgency. So that was really very valuable. But specifically, SAGES was focused on surgeon wellness during the pandemic and the collective emotional toll of our surgeons, especially that was exacerbated by concerns for personal health, family health, the risk of infection, the fear of deployment, financial hardship, and then the anxiety about returning to a new normal when clinical practice resumed. So the pandemic definitely presented an opportunity to reflect on all this and to really address all these factors that we know contribute to burnout and impaired wellness. I'm looking forward to the work that the RPS is doing and is going to continue doing this year. A very active committee led by Leanne Feldman, our current president, that really will be focused on developing opportunities to better integrate our surgeons in healthcare systems as it relates to wellness. And that's really important to be able to achieve this work-life balance and really make sure that we're sustainable, that we achieve longevity in the workplace and don't burn out. This is actually a quote from my chair at Mount Sinai, 7 years to build, it's 57 to deconstruct our surgical department. There's other lessons that we learn, obviously, as an organization and as institutions from the pandemic I want to touch upon. Obviously, efficiency, and I think our industry partners agree. We've had to become much more efficient and nimble with our resources and be more effective in our programs and really come up with creative solutions, in particular to deal with social distancing. We have embraced telehealth platforms. I think that's been a wonderful addition. When it comes to thinking about our vulnerable populations, we've been much more mindful of taking care of our patients, our vulnerable patients, especially cancer patients, for those of us who do cancer surgery. How do you manage a cancer patient who has no access or limited access to facilities for surgery or even for chemoradiation therapy? It's been a real struggle, and we've had to be very creative to partner with these institutions that were not so disrupted from the pandemic, and also to come up with ways to embrace other ways of doing things. For example, there's been a lot of literature on using total neoadjuvant therapy, chemoradiation before surgery, which helps postpone the need for surgery. So we've really accelerated that process and really thought about alternative pathways to be able to deal with this pandemic. And then as educators at our own institutions, we've obviously gone virtual, and it's not a bad thing because I think in what other scenario would you be able to achieve 100% attendance at 6 o'clock in the morning? I mean, come on. So it's been really a very good thing. And as a surgical society, we have learned and are still learning how to incorporate virtual platforms, teaching and learning platforms, and create these learning opportunities for our trainees and our communities. So that's been a really important effort. If you look at the productivity during the COVID pandemic, we had 12 webinars with attendance from 300 to over 1,000 from around the world. Not all members, these are free webinars. And so the amount of education that went on during the pandemic was remarkable. And I want to give a special shout out to Andy Wright, who's the Facebook master, who really helped coordinate all this effort. And that was really wonderful. And then I want to mention also some of the creative things that SAGES has been doing as a society. And so obviously there's a lot of concern about hands-on training. How do we train our residents during this time? So the ADOPT program, which was always been very successful with hands-on training, actually did their very first virtual from-home training course on a hernia model. And it was quite successful, and that was essentially a proof of concept that you can pull this off using a surgical trainer and a virtual telementoring platform. And this is the first of its kind, and this is SAGES through and through. And then finally, research. For those of us who do research, we've been very focused on continuing those clinical trials, making sure they're still accruing. We've had to be very creative, negotiating with our IRBs to do remote consenting, remote monitoring, remote study visits, and it works. But in light of the decreased fundings that we're seeing, especially prioritizing COVID research, we've had to be really creative. And I've been really impressed with the fact that you've seen emerge a lot of international collaborative cohort studies, pooling our data together. And it's really a wonderful effort because you get a global community of surgeons working together that increases the diversity of institutions that participate in research and the diversity in a patient, the pool of patients that we're looking at. So I think that effort is going to continue. It's been very fruitful, and I'm excited about the future in that regard.
Pat, we're all here today because we're hoping to make an attempt to get back to something we might have previously called normal, but I think we've also all learned that it's a new normal. It's not the normal we were used to.
No, definitely not.
How would you counsel us in light of all that you've shared, both about your own experience and about the SAGES experience, about how we define what that is and aim for it?
There's no question that we're not going entirely back to normal. We have to be real. But I think we've become much more introspective about, again, what works, especially for SAGES, what programs work and what needs to be changed. What I'm really excited about is I think we know that we have to consolidate resources and be more nimble, but also continue to do what SAGES does best, which is to educate, collaborate, and continue to innovate, especially in collaboration with our industry partners and especially with other professional organizations. To continue, that will help really augment the impact of our initiatives and our programs. I think we also need specifically to appraise hybrid models for training and teaching our residents. That's going to be very important, and continue to vet and validate all these training models, these new technologies in that realm is going to be a big focus of our organization. But I think we also need to be very, very, very sharp focused, not only on our members and their well-being as they return to clinical practice, but also on our trainees, but especially on our vulnerable patients. There's been a lot of our patients who've been disenfranchised during the pandemic, and it's going to be very important to be really laser focused on their needs as we move forward. But I want to turn this to you, John, because there's no question that there's also been a lot going on in other areas of the world, and the pandemic has highlighted a lot of disparities in healthcare across the field. And it's also, obviously, we've come to face, the harsh reality of structural racism in all our organizations and institutions, including our medical system, and pervasive lack of diversity and inclusion and equity in our organizations, including our organization, our leadership structure. So I'm really curious to see how you've reflected, especially as a leader, as a lifelong sponsor and ally, as a educator. I mean, you've done it all. I really would love to get your input.
Well, thanks, Pat. I would have to say that it's put me very much in a learner mode, the experiences of this past year. We all know the theory of the theme of blind spots, and there's probably many of us in this audience that have been through 360s or other ways of getting acquainted with what our own personal blind spots would be. But as surgeons, we think anatomically, and when you think about literally what a blind spot is in terms of our anatomy, it's a structure that makes it possible for us to see, but gets in the way for one small area of what we actually can understand or perceive about the world around us. And I think that's a powerful metaphor for what some of us have seen this past year. Obviously, the themes of racism are things that have historical roots in our society, but very present realities and ramifications. And I think we were forced to face that, those of us who maybe had more of a blind spot about it in ways that we had not been in recent years. This obviously came to us through a number of pathways, the murder of George Floyd and others in the early part of the time coincident with the pandemic, and the way that made us aware of the lingering tensions and outcomes of racism in our society and how it affected especially marginalized and underrepresented, undervoiced groups. As an organization that thinks about disparities in care and outcomes in a deep way, well before all this happened, it made me reflect on the disparities in our healthcare system, and I think a lot of us saw that brought under a different kind of lens through the pandemic as we saw our weakest populations most deeply affected and at risk. That book I have on this slide in the middle, which my daughter encouraged me to read a few years ago, is by an internist in Chicago who spent most of his career at Mount Sinai and Cook County taking care of the indigent and less privileged population. And he highlights that you can go 3 stops on the blue line in Chicago and your life expectancy drops by almost 20 years. In my own town of Springfield, it's a town of 120,000, rural Illinois, nothing like the urban metropolis of a Chicago or New York, but there's a lake where actually a number of our faculty live. Your average life expectancy if you live on the lake is 86 years. Mm-hmm. About 15 minutes away on the northeast side of town, it's 20 years less. Just facing these things of how we can have the most expensive healthcare system in the world, and when it's at its best, maybe is the best, but still be missing the mark on those kind of issues, really was brought home to us in a way that I don't think, at least I had been perceiving and thinking about as I should. And finally, in the roles that I was privileged to steward this past year, particularly with the American Board of Surgery, I was forced to think about what's our history and what are we doing about it if it needs to change. And are we paying lip service to these things, or are we doing things that will hold ourselves accountable to real progress and change? The picture on the right that I show there is the American Board of Surgery as it existed at its formation in 1937. And it's pretty obvious looking at the picture that it's a lot of people that look a lot like me. How is this going to change? And really, that was my frontline seat to thinking about the practical applications of the race issue as it pertains to our profession, to our role as surgeons and as caregivers to our society, and the public trust that we rely on to do that. The way this came about, many of you will remember that we had probably our biggest public relations disaster in the history of the board last July, when our qualifying exam failed due to an attempt to deliver it through a virtual platform and use virtual proctoring. That was the point that failed. There was no off-the-shelf way to do it at the time. We were trying not to slow down the progress of people who'd planned their lives around taking the exam. Because of the timing of the pandemic and the lead time you need to deploy an exam, we had to make that decision right as the pandemic came down on us in the spring. It was a miserable failure and deeply affected those we're there to serve. We had been planning at that point to devote our fall retreat to the theme of the future of oral examinations. In light of what was going on in our society, particularly around the theme of racism, we knew we had to make a pivot, and I was fortunate to be joined to Joe Beisky as our president and CEO, a wonderful, amazing leader, as this audience knows, former president of SAGES. And together and along with other inputs we had on the board, we decided we needed to make a quick pivot, even in the midst of all the challenges we were already navigating with our examination format, and devote our September retreat not to how we were going to do oral exams, but to the theme of racism and anti-racism and what it would mean for us as a leadership organization to lean into that and really take a deeper dive with the intent of change. We were very fortunate to have two men shown in this slide. The man in the bottom is Paris Butler. Paris is a wonderful reconstructive surgeon at the University of Pennsylvania. He's been a deep thinker about issues of racism and how it affects society and underprivileged populations, as well as our profession, for many years. Paris was already on our board of directors based on a new governance structure we put in place that was in part designed to bring a different kind of diversity and input to the board and its processes. And he teamed with John Stewart, who's the middle picture. John was on our council. He's the founding chair of a new cancer center at LSU. And they together put together our fall retreat, and it was a powerful event. The role that I got to play, I didn't have the important voice, but I had a role to play in deciding who got the mic. And that was one of my first lessons, is we may not have the stories that need to be told, but we can give opportunity if we're in positions of leadership and influence and stewardship for the organization to let those voices be heard. John and Paris brought together a lineup of black colleagues, many of whom, probably all of whom would be recognized by this audience for their prominence, and simply had them tell their stories of experiencing racism within our profession. There were people in tears on the call. It was probably the most moving event I've ever been part of as a professional. I remember one story in particular from Ed Barksdale, who's the chief of pediatric surgery at Rainbow in Cleveland. He told the story of driving in the middle of the night to take care of a patient, being stopped because he was a black man driving a reasonably good-looking car, explaining who he was, not being believed, showing his badge. It was assumed it was a falsified badge, and he was actually taken to the station. The only way he was released to go do what he was rushing to do was the supervisor of the policeman who arrested him happened to have had their child saved by Dr. Barksdale in the recent past, recognized the name, and said, no, he's the right guy, let him go. Hearing those kind of stories and realizing this was what colleagues at my shoulder had endured in doing the things that they were called to do, that I had never had to deal with, was very powerful. And it put all of us in a place of humility and learning to cherish the teachability of those tender times. We learned that we needed to lean into difficult conversations, and as Paris put it one time, take-backs are allowed. So blundering, but then seeing your error and being willing to be corrected became a new habit we aspired to. And we learned that we could again practice allyship, and we could do that with intentionality, not wait for the circumstance, but look for ways to do it. One of the powerful moments in the retreat was when a man named Mark Neve, who's a senior administrator at UT Southwestern, was speaking, and he just looked at the audience virtually and said, I have to tell you, I'm tired of talking about race. What he was saying that is, as a black man and a leader in the profession, he was always expected to be and asked to be the voice. And it was wearying to him, and there needed to be other voices. And so we all had to lean into that and think about it and how to do it, not just as a fringe or frame on our operations, but to change the very fabric of how we went about our business. So a few of the things that came from that, I won't take all our time dwelling on it, but again, these were my personal lessons, was a wonderful white paper that John and Paris led that's been published in Annals, a task force that in follow-up to the retreat came up with a series of action plans. I won't list them all, but one of them was to hire for the first time an executive level DEI officer for the American Board of Surgery, and that's Ada Okafor, who's pictured there, was hired this past April. And the other was leaning into a new competency model for how we populated the board, as opposed to our old nomination through society pattern. It's not to get away with representation of societies, but it's to make sure that the needs of the board in doing the business that we're called to are met by a diverse and inclusive group of constituents and voices. You can see the most recent members elected to the council, and it's a more diverse looking group than the first picture I showed. Andrea Hayes Jordan, the lady in the upper left there, was just named the first black woman to be chair of surgery at Howard, and only the second black woman to be a chair of surgery in the United States, Kay Marie King, having been named at Albany back in July. So, boy, that's a late change, but at least we've got two in the last 2 months. Maybe that's a trajectory we can sustain.
And so what were some of your personal lessons also from the process, John?
Thank you, Pat. There was a lot that I was learning personally, and this is very much an ongoing process for me. I think one of the things I learned was that if you're serving in leadership, there's an inward journey you have to be engaged on to parallel the outward journey you're trying to navigate. If you aren't growing and changing as a person, you can't lean into these things and help accomplish what needs to be done. And that means vulnerability, it means openness, it means teachability, and it means pursuit of those goals, intentional pursuit. There's a quote I came to really love this past year by the man pictured there in the lower right, Max Dupree, who was president and CEO of a furniture company for many years. And his quote was summarizing his experience in leadership, and he said, "The first job of the leader is to define reality." As you commented on earlier in our time today, we spent a lot of time this past year defining realities and figuring out what we needed to do with them. He said, though, that the second thing, or the last thing, I'm sorry, not the second thing, the last thing was to say thank you. A leader always has to be in a position of gratitude for the privilege and to view it as a stewardship. In between those first and last things, he said the leader must be a debtor and a servant. That quote meant a lot to me this past year. How can I define reality or listen to the realities that others are helping me see that I'd missed? How can I work from a place of gratitude? And how can I serve and feel a sense of indebtedness to all around me? That was the inward journey that I found myself on. The other thing I think I learned was that there are different skill sets we need to lead in uncertain times, and we all learned that in different ways, depending on our context. It wasn't the same for everybody, but I think we all learned some parallel lessons. One of those was the importance of collective intelligence, which is obviously the theme of our title for our talk today. And how do we develop that? As part of that, how do we accept conflict as a constructive exercise, which is tough for conflict-averse people like I tend to be? And how do we work on the character things in us that are actually the barriers to change and us being part of the change? That involves some introspection, some reflection, some vulnerability, some acknowledgement of one's flaws. And then finally, I think we learned that there were other contexts that we could learn from. Some of them were ones we were used to learning from, but maybe not in the ways that we needed to learn now, and I'll try to elaborate on that a little bit. This is just one paper by a group that included management folks at Vanderbilt and the University of Michigan. And we're used to thinking about high reliability organizations that we can learn from, like aviation or nuclear reactor plants, et cetera. but we usually think of it in terms of the check boxes and sort of the objective tools. I don't think we've thought about it a lot in terms of how those people work together, what's the behavioral and affective culture of the organization. And this was an area of learning for me. In this article, which is just one example from this field, they talked about this issue of collective intelligence, and that mindfulness, which we often think of as a personal or almost private and meditative thing, could be cultivated at a collective level, and it was actually a requirement in high-performing organizations to have a way to behaviorally lean into things with collective intelligence and the emotions needed to support that, to find errors and adapt and correct them as they evolved in an unexpected setting. And then finally, that this led to a kind of function that was actually beyond what any of us could individually do psychologically or culturally. And these are obviously celebrated in places such as pictured on the slide, like a nuclear plant or perhaps an aircraft carrier. The other thing I learned was that instead of looking sort of at what's in front of oneself and one's own checklist for the day, that this required that we be looking to those around us for guidance and input and monitoring and this mindful frame of reference. And that means that we have to want to expend our effort to serve others, and that we have to be able to live in a place of emotional ambivalence at times. You alluded to the grief and at the same time the need to go on doing your job as you navigated things in New York City. Many of you have heard the so-called Stockdale paradox, and Stockdale is reflection, as you know from that, was having survived the Hanoi Hilton and asked, how did you do that? He said, you have to face the harshest aspects of your reality, but never lose hope that in the end you'll prevail. And I think that's something we learned in this past year. It's interesting, as many of you have read or listened to the cockpit transmissions from the Miracle on the Hudson, and about 23 seconds before they were in the water, this was what Sully said to Jeff, his co-pilot. Got any ideas? Actually not. Didn't really change much, but just the fact that 20 seconds before being in the water, he was still trying to use collective intelligence. There's something very instructive about that.
So, John, based on this experience, so how do you envision SAGES playing a role in confronting all these issues, especially of life diversity, inclusion, equity within the organization and beyond the organization, and disparities in surgical care in general?
Thankfully, Pat, I would say that one thing we were very fortunate to have in SAGES was a little bit of a runway before we got into the challenges and the acuteness of them in the past year. And I would highlight here Dan Jones during his presidency, 2017 and 18. Dan formed We Are SAGES, and it was designed to promote diversity within the organization and to give a voice to more diverse groups of leaders in the organization. Dana Tellem, who along with Adnan has put together this wonderful program we're all enjoying, was the first leader of that. And then in Rory Pryor's presidency, which you've already alluded to, Rory sought to make that work enfranchised as the very development and leadership development specifically path for the organization, and created a new pathway in our master's program devoted to leadership and professional development. And that was where We Are SAGES and our diversity efforts were housed. And I think it was a brilliant stroke of saying, this isn't like something we do on the side, but actually as we develop leadership within the organization and equip people to take back to their organizations leadership skills, this is where it's going to be housed. This is how we do that. It's part of what we're baking into the mix. And in this past year, that evolved, I think, due to some wonderful leadership. And I would highlight Horacio, Leanne Feldman, and you, Pat, as our liaison from exec to what began the year as our LPD committee and became the DLPD, adding the word diversity to the name to specifically highlight and emphasize that. This came about through some wonderful and deep conversations that the leadership facilitated, and I would specifically highlight Aaliyah Qureshi, who chaired that committee, Jason Kuhn and Shanita Johnson as co-chairs, For those of you who were at the award luncheon yesterday, Dr. Johnson received our inaugural Social Justice Award from SAGES, and very well deserved. These people's leadership, their voices, and the way they amplified the voices of others put us in a very different place in this process than we otherwise might have been, building on the foundation that people like Dana and Rory and Dan had laid for us. So a few of the products that have come from that I'd just highlight for this group is a 5-point barrier-specific focus strategy to increase DEI and opportunity and transparency about how that comes about in our organization and mentorship for the same. A white paper that's soon to be going to the journal and that this group has led. And I would highlight Aaliyah and Shanita for their work on that, as well as yourself. The second version of a climate survey, which was also part of what We Are SAGES did back in 2017 and 18, to show us where our blind spots were as an organization. And that involves ongoing accountability, and how are you going to know if you've changed and if you're ongoingly making changes if you aren't assessing that again. A DEI grant proposal that Jenny Shao, pictured there, helped lead, and that actually got submitted, I think, Tuesday. To the American College of Surgeons. Wonderful work. And then a cultural complications curriculum. And this is the work of, and Dana helped bring this to the fore, Dana Tellem, but Chelsea Harris is who this comes from. Chelsea is a plastics fellow at the University of Maryland and really came up with this on her own. It's a powerful way to think about how working through cultural things in much the format that we do with M&Ms can be a way we learn, and that actually leaning into our errors in these areas is a helpful strategy. And the DLPD committee is working on amplifying and using that as a strategy within SAGES. And finally, to focus on the social determinants of health, again, as an outcomes-oriented organization, to be asking ourselves, how can we keep paying attention to that and put it front and center in our research efforts as a society and in our focus on outcomes. So Pat, I'd like to ask you just to step away now from all we've been talking about for SAGES and our own journey professionally, and just say, what's this been like for you as Pat Sylla, and what are the lessons that you found, and is there something that you found in all this that we've been through that gives you hope and joy for the future?
Well, as you and many people know, I've lost my father 5 months ago in the aftermath of COVID. So it was brutal, but as we were celebrating his life, I reflected on everything he's accomplished, especially where he came from, and the number of barriers that he broke and the ceilings that he literally shattered as a West African man who was an orphan at the age of 15 and became a high-level executive, for the first computer-based company in West Africa. And he did this with poise and grace, and was absolutely devoted to the well-being of his country, invested everything in his country. And I couldn't be more proud, remembering him and honoring him and his legacy of being his daughter. And it gives me a lot of joy to reflect on what he's accomplished, and it gives me a lot of optimism about the future and what can be done with limited resources and pulling together. So that's kept me going. What about you, John? I have to ask you the same question. What has given you joy and hope about the future?
Let me just say first, thanks for taking a process of grief and turning it into a source of inspiration. That's powerful. This may be a little more mundane, but I think my experience this past year on a more personal nature was as we went through times when we were not supposed to go into the office unless we had to, and I found myself working from home more, as many did at one phase or another of the pandemic. I found myself getting into a new discipline, and that was going for walks, particularly with the lady pictured there, my wife of almost 38 years now. And the times we had together, the conversations we had, the space to do it, and simply the appreciation of natural beauty. You have a couple of views of the path we walk, which is just a converted railway line into a bike and walking trail near our home. Really just breathed a new sense of joy into my life, even in the midst of the challenges we were facing. One day on a walk this past spring, I saw and was so moved by it, I started to take pictures with my phone, and these are all flowers simply growing in the weeds on the side of that path. I realized I'd been not noticing these things, but there they were in all their beauty just around me. And it made me reflect on where I was putting my confidence and hope for the things we're continuing to work through. And I couldn't help but think of the old verse from the Sermon on the Mount where it says, if this is how God takes care of the grass that grows on the side of the road, basically, and we mow down, shouldn't there be a place of trust we can find for the things we need? And it really was a powerful reminder to me of the importance of witnessing and leaning into the things around us that are there for our strength and our inspiration. And I would say, if I were to apply that to us here today as we wrap up, Sages is like that. We can walk right by, but we can stop for a moment, look at the colleagues around us, look at the people in this room, hear their stories, learn from them, be inspired by them, and have a different kind of beauty that we can reference as we try to think for what we do next. And if I were to try to summarize everything that we've tried to talk about, Pat, I think I'd like to just tell a quick story about Arthur Ashe and share this quote as we wrap up. You know his story. This is a man who became a tennis pro in 1969, won Wimbledon, the US Open, the Australian Open. To this day, he's the only black man who's accomplished that. At age 43, needed open heart surgery, got AIDS from a blood transfusion before we had great therapy, and died 10 years later. But this quote says so much, I think, about what we've all learned. True heroism is remarkably sober and very undramatic. It's not the urge to surpass all others at whatever cost, but the urge to serve others at whatever cost. As I look at the metaphor of that picture, I see a man, not just because of his color, but because of his excellence, who's in a teaching mode. And he's passing it on to the next generation. And they're there because they can identify with his leadership and his example. But I also love that there's a person with a demographic a lot like me in the background, and I see joy in their face as they watch him teaching someone else from his skill and his experience. That ball seems to unify all of them, and their focus on it is, I think, what's important. And Pat, I think if we can keep our eyes on that kind of ball as an organization, we'll continue to grow and do the things that we're called to do as Sages. Thanks for the time with you today.
You said it better than anyone. Thank you, John. Thank you.